Hello. This presentation is meant to introduce critical theory. And critical theory is an area that is supposed to introduce a variety of ways to approach a literary and artistic production. It means that there are many ways to approach a piece of art, and the richness of literature needs a variety of ways to consider this literary literature. And before we deal with these approaches in their diversity, in their complexity, we are going to introduce the premises upon which they are based, the strategies that they are dealing with, and discuss their limitations. And before that, my point in this introduction is to question the significance of art in itself, the nature of art in itself, and art as a complex invention of human imagination has been considered throughout centuries by philosophers, thinkers, and artists up to now. And I'd like to draw you back to the question of art and the nature of art through the Greek philosophers, Aristotle and Plato. And my question is, what is art? What is the nature of art? What is the function of art? Before we see how to deal with art. And in the Greeks, they believe that the muses were goddesses of inspiration. They are protectors of art, and they are the source of knowledge included in poetry, lyrics, and myths. This was the belief that these goddesses protect and inspire. Back to the Greek times, the reference to Daedalus himself as a mythical figure, a prototype of the skillful artist, and Daedalus means skillfully wrought and is an epitome of creativity and imagination. And this Daedalus, just as a matter of fact, when you read, for example, James Joyce in the 20th century novel, A Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man, you will see that this novel is based on the myth of Daedalus as a source of creativity. And the myth of Daedalus shows that Daedalus was escaping from place to place, from prison to prison, until he is fed up with escape. And at the end, he imagined wings to fly with as an example of freedom. So creating wings are the example of the creating ways to escape from imprisonment. And in James Joyce's Support of the Artist as a Young Man, we find that the protagonist was escaping from series of seclusions and imprisonment, whether they were familial, religious, educational, until he managed to escape from the shackles which he considered as stifling the human imagination. And he said at the end that he was escaped through imagination, language, silence, and cunning. So what I want to say here is that literature is art. It is first a body of written works. It is imaginative work of poetry, prose, and distinguished and perceived for their aesthetic excellence. So when I see art, I ask question, is it history? Is it philosophy? Is it knowledge? Is it sociology? Is it anthropology? It is all of these and none of these. One thing that I maintain from this definition of art, that it is based on aesthetic criteria. When I define art, I go back to Plato and Aristotle, and Plato and Aristotle are the fathers of critical theory, though they disagree on the definition, on the concept of art. One thing that they agree on that is that Plato, they agree on the fact that art is based on mimesis, that is, imitation, a representation, though Plato objects to poetry, and we'll see why. Aristotle defends art. They both agree that art is essentially an imitation of nature. So, the source of art, according to them, is imitation. And the basic point that is debated in mimesis is that it is a basic theoretical principle in the creation of art. And mimesis means imitation, but it includes also the sense of representation rather than copying. Plato and Aristotle mimesis as the representative of nature, but Plato sees imitation as a mere copy of life. It is a copy of copy because it is based on his philosophical percept that life, it is just a shadow of an ideal life, an ideal reality that exists somewhere else. But Aristotle says that imitation is not a mere copy of life or the world, but it is a recreated ideal copy of the world. Now, from beginning, we find this disagreement between these two philosophers. Of course, Plato was a utopian, an idealist. He believed that everything had an ideal form. That is to say, the world that we live in, it is just a copy or a shadow of a real world that exists somewhere else. So it's difficult to copy a world that we cannot see. So it is for him, copying and imitating is dangerous and an obstacle to the contemplation of truth. It doesn't lead to conceive the truth. While Aristotle disagreed with much of Plato's philosophy, and he believed in looking at the real world and studying it. So according to Plato, Aristotle, imitation is a reflection of reality. Now, Plato's objections is based on the fact that art imitates the world as it appears, not as it is. So that's why for him it is false. Art is a copy of particular objects, which are themselves copy of higher things. That's why I see, according to Plato, the artist cannot reach the truth, and he is only living in the realm of illusion and images. And so for Plato here, the function of art is to deceive from reality and to guide the observer, the reader, into a realm of illusion and false images. While artists produce for him bad fiction, false stories that have bad effects on their listeners and create fear of that. That's why he said that art should be censored. And so he was the first philosopher to censor art. Example, Homer's Iliads and Odysseys were banned for him because they are telling false stories and they are not good for the next generation. Also, the epistemological objection of Plato is that the work of art does not give us any knowledge of the world. So, since he says it is false, so for him as a philosopher, he is for the truth. And for him, the artists do not know what they are doing. So they are just presenting something which is, they cannot see, they cannot perceive, that they imagine, and which is false. Also, since I talked about censorship, his moral objection lies on the fact that art, the pursuit of knowledge, is the pursuit of the good. And if art produces ignorance, then art is immoral. And for him, art does not appeal to the highest faculty of the soul, that is pure reason, and it only appeals to the senses, the desire for pleasure, or rather to reason and the desire for knowledge. So according to Plato, the pursuit as a philosopher, the pursuit of truth and knowledge is a priority. That's why he attacks art and artists, and because it appeals only to desires and pleasure. And here he reminds me of the opposite view of the romantics I have in mind. Wordsworth, as you know that, Wordsworth is that the spontaneous overflow of feelings that he defends. So, and Plato is against such a thing in his utopian world. So Plato's objection is on art is, first of all, this is based on falsehood. For him, philosophy is better than poetry. And because the philosopher deals with idea and truth, he is welcome. And for him, the poet cannot reach the truth, and he deals only with what appears to him. So he is only in the realm of illusion, not the truth, not reality. And since the art deals with illusion, they are imitation of an imitation, and the artist, according to him, is twice removed from reality. So how can he represent something he doesn't know? And though Plato's reject the poets and art, his inquiries are highly illuminating and provocative, because he initiates the debate here, and that's what pushes Aristotle to respond and to produce a theory of art. Plato is, of course, a philosopher. As a moralist, he disapproves of poetry. It is, as I said, is immoral. As a philosopher, he disapproves of it because it is based on falsehood. Philosophy is better than poetry. Philosopher, according to him, deals with the truth and the ideas, where the poet deals with what appears to him. The truth of philosophy is more important than the pleasure of poetry here. So he associates philosophy with truth, while poetry with pleasure and illusion and falsehood. So and it's true, because Plato's chief interest is philosophy, and philosophical investigation here, which formed the subject of his great work in the dialogues. Not a profound critic of literature, unlike Aristotle, as we'll see, and his critical ideas are scattered in his dialogues. The same thing here, I repeat, that ideas are the ultimate realities, things conceived as ideas before they take practical shapes. And the artist, the poet, takes man away from reality than towards it. And the same idea is that he deals with illusion. The three objections of Plato is that poetry is not ethical, not philosophical, or pragmatic, either on the level of education, philosophy, or moral point of view. So his arguments are based on a philosophical dimension, and also on the fact that he is building a utopia which is governed by philosophers. And when you say that his republic, we have philosophers, soldiers, and slaves, we can have the mind and the masses at work. So there is no room for art according to Plato. Why? Not ethical, because it promotes undesirable passions. Not philosophical, it does not provide true knowledge. Not pragmatic, it is inferior to the practical arts and therefore has no educational value. I quote here Plato for his objection. If we mean our future guardians to regard the habit of quarreling among themselves as of all things the basest, no word should be said to them of the wars in the heaven, of the plots and fighting of the gods against one another, for they are not true. And you can see here there is an allusion to Homer's Iliad and Odyssey, where you have fighting of the gods, and we have plots, wars between gods, and they are not true according to him. So he objected on the ground that poetry does not cultivate good habits among children. So art for him should be, if it is to be introduced, it should be morally edifying. His objection also to mimesis is that the imitator or maker of the image knows nothing of true existence. He knows only appearance. And since he knows appearance, he cannot go in depth into the truth. Poetry, like all forms of art, appeals to the inferior part of the soul, the irrational and the emotional part. So that's why Plato here is for the reason. The irrational, the emotional is eliminated. And an appreciation of poetry is incompatible with an appreciation of reason, justice, and the search for the truth. And for him, poetry only arouses emotions, imaginary sorrows and unhappiness. So that's why it's not accepted. The same thing in this quote here is that there is an ancient quarrel between philosophy and poetry, of which there are many proofs, and there are innumerable other signs of ancient enmity between them. Notwithstanding this, let us assure our sweet friend and the sister arts of imitation that if she will only prove her title to exist in a well-ordered state, we shall be delighted to receive her. We are very conscious of her charms, but we may not on that account betray the truth. So, ironically, the charms of art is not accepted in this well-ordered state because it is betraying the truth on which he is basing his ordered, well-ordered state that is based on reason and the truth. Poetry feeds and waters the passions instead of drying them up. She lets them rule, although they ought to be controlled if mankind are ever to increase in happiness and virtue. No room for poetry because it waters, arouses feeling and passions, and also it does not make people happy. Of course, these ideas here are completely refuted. First, because Plato fails to understand that art also gives something more which is absent in the actual world, and the artist does not simply reflect the real in the manner of a mirror. Art is not a passive or superficial imitation of reality, but it reproduces life in all its totality, and it is an addition. There are views, there are vision introduced by the human imagination. R.A. Scott James observed that, but though the poet creates something less than that reality as Plato maintains, he also creates something more. He puts an idea into it, he puts his perception into it, he gives us his intuition of certain distinctive and essential qualities. So very important here, there is an additional point that is added by the creator who is the poet. That is, he starts from the truth, from reality, in order to make it, but he produced something superior to this reality, as we'll see with Aristotle. Again, Plato says that art is bad. It does not inspire virtue. It does not teach morality. And one of the questions that we ask Plato, but is teaching the function of the arts? Is the aim of the art? Is it the aim of the artist? So art is not to teach. It has other function. The function of art is to provide aesthetic delight, communicate experience, express emotion, represent life. It should never be confused with the function of ethics, which is simply to teach morality. And morality and ethics is another area, is another realm. It is the role of religious people. It is the role of the moralist. It's not the role of the artist. The artist is concerned with something else. Seeing these points by Plato, and Plato, when he objects to art, on the opposite, Aristotle defends art and says that imitation is very important because it is one instinct of nature, our nature. And the object of it is are man in action. And for him, comedy is an imitation of characters of a lower kind, while tragedy is an imitation of action that is serious, complete, and of a certain magnitude. And you can see that Aristotle defends tragedy much more because it represents the noble human aspiration, man's with noble aim, defending himself, trying to control his fate, though at the end in the tragic figure, but it represents the nobility of a human quest for the truth. And the function of tragedy, according to Aristotle, again, is to arouse the emotion of pity and fear. And that is why to affect the catharsis of these emotions: purification, clarification, and providing the audience with pleasure. You can see that Aristotle, he defends tragedy for its cathartic pleasure. And catharsis is very important, as we'll see here, when we deal with the psychological approach. It is psychologically relieving. This is the psychological dimension of art, according to Aristotle, besides presenting a certain reality. And according to Aristotle here, art is an attempt to grasp universal truth. In addition to this cathartic dimension, we have the universality, as we'll see. The nature of poetry here, it is poetic inspiration. So with Aristotle, we start to think about inspiration. And where does this inspiration come from? It's divine, it is human, it is natural, it is multiple. He agrees with Plato in calling the poet an imitator and creative art, but according to Aristotle, the poet imitates one of the three objects: things as they were or are, things as they are said, thought to be, or things as they ought to be. So present, past, and probably future. In conclusion, we find that the poet imitates what is past or present, what is commonly believed, and what is ideal. Extend the range of periods from past to present to future, and never limitlessness of the presentation of the poet. And there is a natural, according to Aristotle, natural pleasure in imitation, which is instinctive. It enables the child to learn as well here. So we can see that it is against Plato's objection to art. And the poet, the instinct for harmony and rhythm, what we imitate, it is life, the sound, the things that we live with. Aristotle also, in addition to this mimetic dimension of art, he compares the artist with the historian. And the poets and the historian, according, differ not by their medium, but the true difference is that the historian relates what has happened, events, people, in a certain limited period with real name, but the poet relates what may or may ought to have happened, the ideal. And if I have to compare the poet with the historian, the poet starts where the historian ends or stops. And if the historian relates real events in a certain, so the poet is going to question the motivation. And this motivation can be cognitive, can be emotional, can be spiritual, can be whatever. So here the poet is going to reflect on human motivation. That is, we say he is in quest for the ideal. And according to Aristotle, poetry is more philosophical and a higher thing than history, which expresses the particular. And you can see that if Plato is putting philosophy in a higher degree and art in a lower degree, we see that Aristotle defends poetry because it's more than history, more than philosophy, more than the particular, but it moves beyond that. And it gives the poet a higher status. And because poetry, according to him, expands to express the universal. Therefore, the picture of poetry pleases all and all the times. And with Aristotle, we find the timelessness of art and the universality. That is to say, puts art and artists in a higher position. Aristotle doesn't agree with Plato in the function of poetry to make people weaker and emotional or too sentimental. According to Aristotle, catharsis is ennobling, very positive. And the end, according for him, of poetry is to please. However, if it pleases, it teaches. And such pleasing is superior to the other pleasure because it teaches civic morality. Therefore, for Aristotle, all good literature gives pleasure that is not diverse from moral lessons. So it's not directly moral teaching, but we learn, we know, through pleasure. David Daichi summarizes Aristotle's views in reply to Plato's charges. Tragedy or art gives new knowledge, yields aesthetic satisfaction, and produces a better state of mind. Very important, positive impression about expression of art according to Aristotle, because it is a source of knowledge, it has an aesthetic value, and it produces a very important situation. Unified action also, with its several incidents so closely connected that the transposal or withdrawal of any one of them will disjoin and dislocate the whole. Organic unity. Apart from these things, Aristotle thinks that art has this unity which gives a certain pleasure and which is a certain aim. And here you can see that since we are talking about tragedy, tragedy is based on 5 acts: exposition, arising action, climax, and foreign action, and the catastrophe, which lead to what you have, the denouement and the catharsis, and so on, so on, so on. You can see that it's poetry, we have stanzas and the form, and so on. So it is unity also. It is the organic unity which is meant by this. And this is what gives art this unity. According to Aristotle here, poetry is more philosophical than history, as we said. We have a quote here: poetry is something more philosophical and of graver importance than history, since its statements are of the nature rather of universals, whereas those of history are singulars, the particular versus the universal. The poet will start from the particularity of a historical event and move to the universality of the event. And the poetry describes not the thing that has happened, as Aristotle imagined history does, but things that what might happen. Thus, it is a mirror of history, and art is necessarily conceptual and cognitive. That is to say, it tries to conceptualize what is there, meant from starting from a historical movement into reflection on that moment and the ideas that is produced by this moment. So I have had to sum up Aristotle Poetics. You can see very important points here. Very similitude. Art is similar to reality, to the truth. Catharsis, the emotional aspect of art. History, difference between historian and artist. Philosophy, it is philosophical. Universality, unity. These are some of the principles introduced by Aristotle. And when I mention these points, especially when I say catharsis, history, philosophy, universality, you can see that probably I am introducing some of the approaches that we will deal. When I say catharsis, I am in the psychological approach, and the text can be approached psychologically, a historical approach, philosophical moral approach, and also the formalist approach. You can see that these elements give us hints to the types of approaches that we can use in order to deal with a piece of art. Starting from the philosophers, the Greek philosophers, we move to the Dark Ages and the Middle Ages, where art was in the service of the church and the condemnation of art because it is immoral, and which goes with the Puritanical view, which goes again with Plato's view that art should be censored because it rouses the emotions. After the Renaissance, we have Sidney in his defense poetry against the Puritans, and we can say the argument between Sidney and the Puritans is similar to that of Aristotle and Plato. And after the Renaissance, Sidney defends the poet as a maker, as an enchanter. So he gives the idea of creator and also someone who enchants, bringing pleasure. Shelley, with the Romantics, for him art awakens and enlarges mind. We have the poet as the legislator of the word. Poetry is a mirror which makes beautiful that which is distorted. That poetry can change something, distort into something which is beautiful. Samuel Johnson, poetry is the art of uniting pleasure with truth. Byron, from the Romantic period, poetry is the lava of the imagination whose eruption prevents an earthquake. Very important reflection on the power of imagination. So all these, from Aristotle to the after the Renaissance, the neoclassicists, the classicists, until the Romantics, there is the defense of poetry and art, and they all agree that poets search truth, elevated art form, and result pleasure with the purpose of morality. An amalgam of objectives apart from the truth and morality, there is pleasure. Wordsworth, man speaking to man, makes the poet as a man speaking to man, with more lively sensibility. With Coleridge, in his lyrical ballads, as you know, that is the power of imagination, knowledge of the human soul, knowledge of human nature, very important reflection on the importance of art. And for him, poetry is the spontaneous overflow of power feelings, emotions recollected in tranquility, a recollection, contemplation. It follows the idea of Aristotle's catharsis. It is important to emotions which Plato refused and doesn't like, object to. After this brief I-bird view of conception of arts, the meaning of art, I ask question, what is the nature of art? Is it science? Is it knowledge? Is it philosophy? It is all of these, and it is none of these. Of course, literature is imaginative, and probably the thing that we can do to distinguish a piece of art from a piece of non-art is aesthetic criteria. And the tool of art and literature is language. Language, of course, is the material of literature. And this language, of course, is different from science and everyday language. When we take a piece of text and we read it, we can distinguish if it is science or art. Why? Because the language of arts and literature is different from that of science, because it is connotative, metaphorical, full of associations and ambiguities. And also it is divided in genres: lyric, epic, drama, novel. Also, a piece of art, it is distinguished by order, organization, and unity. So if I have to define art, the nature of art, these are some of the elements we can take into account in order to see what. So if we distinguish art as language in a different way, what is the function of art? What is the function of literature? Of course, it is difficult to distinguish it from other fields of knowledge. In art, we have philosophy, we have religion, we have history, we have sociology. It is also a source of knowledge. It includes also the general and the probable. It can be the source of change, which is politically engaged, and also it is changing society. It can incite to social and political change. And it is also a source of relief and gratification. We have catharsis and psychological. It can be just art for art's sake. It can be just a writer writing for the art, the sake of art. So the function of art is very large and wide. And it can incorporate all of these, because art is produced by the human mind in a certain time with a certain aim, and that's why it can be approached from different angles. And here I come to the last question here. How to deal with literature? And here I come to critical theory. And critical here, it's to provide a range of our approaches to read and study, explain and analyze and examine a piece. And in order to sum up these approaches, I can say that critical approaches can take two general directions: extrinsic, intrinsic. And from the adjective ex, you can see external. That is, an extrinsic approach means that I go outside literature and they borrow from other fields to criticize the text. And they can go to biography, that is the biography of the author, and I can analyze the piece of text from the biography of the author. And here I have the biographical approach. Sociology, sociological approach. Philosophical approach. Psychological approach. Mythical archetypal approach. That is to say, I go to other areas, whether it is biography, sociology, philosophy, psychology, mythology, and try to apply some of the premises and try to bring light into the text when I go outside the text and come back to the text. And here we are going to see each approach, and we will see the premises upon which it is based, the strategy we can adopt, and the limitations that can be said or can be dealt with. While the other option, which is intrinsic approach, it is the focus on the text, intrinsic, internal. That is the focus on the text per se in itself. That is to say, when I say an intrinsic approach, no need to go beyond the text. That is to say, we focus only on language, form, imagery, metaphor, associations, internal organization, rhythm, meter, and here we have what you call the formalist approach. And so in general, critical theory is a way to deal with a piece of art, mainly we're dealing with literature, and there are possibilities, and every approach has its strong points and it has its limitations. And the next point is that we're going to see some of these approaches.